to Hotel Bar Sessions, the podcast where three philosophers sit down at the end of a long conference day to chop it up at the hotel bar, which, as we all know, is where the real philosophy happens.
Welcome to another episode of Hotel Bar Sessions. I'm Rick Lee, and I'm joined by Lee Johnson, and unusually, we are without David Gunkel. Never fear, though, we have a guest with us, and we'll get to that in a moment. Today, we are talking about matter and the feminine. But before we do that, let's get some drink orders and find out what you're ranting or raving about. Lee, let's start with you.
I'm going to have 2 fingers of Buffalo Trace, which is a drink that I feel like I just keep ordering over and over. So I'm going to mix it up a little bit this time and have it with 2 rocks instead of a rock. And I am raving today about arguments that we have with ChatGPT. So there's a video going around the internet of this guy asking ChatGPT how many R's there are in the word strawberry. And initially, ChatGPT answers that there are 2 R's in the word strawberry. The guy says, well, no, it seems like there are 3 to me. And ChatGPT says, well, I see how you could have made that mistake. You must be counting the R in the word straw different than the R in the word berry. And of course, he says, can you explain this to me? ChatGPT goes on repeatedly to say that there are 2 R's in the word strawberry. And this just gets more and more absurd as the conversation goes on. But at some point, the guy asks ChatGPT to literally number the letters in the word strawberry and then count the R's. And still, ChatGPT wants to say that there are only 2 R's. I mean, if you're worried about our future robot overlords, I will relieve those worries a little bit by saying that eventually ChatGPT does come around to acknowledging that there are 3 R's in strawberries, but this is just such a hilarious encounter. I'm going to put a link to the video up on the show notes for this episode. I definitely encourage everybody to check it out. It is a good 5 minutes of straight laughter for you.
I got to admit, I've said a stupid thing and stuck to it as long as I could myself.
I hear that. So I am extremely pleased to introduce our guest for today, Emanuela Bianchi. Emma is an associate professor of comparative literature at NYU, and she is the author of The Feminine Symptom, Aleatory Matter in the Aristotelian Cosmos, published by Fordham University Press in 2014, and many other articles and book chapters besides. She is an accomplished scholar in the areas of ancient philosophy and literature, 20th century continental philosophy, feminist and queer theory, and she is a well-recognized and respected Aristotle scholar. Emma is also a very old and very dear friend of both Rick and myself. And before we begin, I want to remind you both that we've all sworn a sacred pact to keep the details of that 20-year friendship between ourselves and no one else, and also to have bail money ready for each other when that time inevitably comes. But for today, I just want to note that this is definitely not our first rodeo at a bar together. But it is the first time that we've done it with mics in front of our faces. So first, welcome, Emma, to the hotel bar. And second, what are you drinking and what are you ranting or raving about this week?
First, thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here at this particular hotel bar with the two of you after many years of bellying up to many different hotel bars and shooting the shit after a long day of conferencing. So it's great to reconvene in this context. And I am drinking today a Bloody Mary, but with a twist. I'm having it with gin rather than with vodka. So there you go.
What are you, communist?
Nostrovia.
She just has very bad taste.
And I'm going to rave today about NYU's prison education program. So I just completed my first week teaching in NYU's prison education program at Walk Hill Prison in upstate New York. And first of all, I'm just so grateful to the program for all the incredible support and extensive orientations and everything we faculty need to have a smooth experience teaching in the prison. But secondly, I want to shout out to an educational situation where there is absolutely no access to the internet. Because I've said for a long, long time to my students that our preferred educational technology in the classroom is pen and paper for both reading and writing. This is the situation that students in the prison are in. And, it just makes for a kind of attentional situation and a level of engagement with the text that doesn't involve screens, does not involve constant distractions, that involves long, concentrated engagement with the text itself. So I'm very, very excited to be teaching in that situation in 2024.
And kudos to you for doing that. I wish there were more of those kinds of programs throughout the nation.
I'm surprised you allow the technology of a pen.
She doesn't allow ballpoint pens like the old Catholic nuns.
I do sometimes say pencils are even better, but...
So, Rick, what about you? What are you drinking and what are you ranting or raving about?
Today I'm going to have a bee's knees, and I am raving about fermentation. So today I was preparing some hot sauce, and I recently discovered that some of the best hot sauces come from fermented peppers. And so as I'm setting my peppers up for the fermentation process, I started thinking about all the wonderful things that fermentation brings to my life. It brings, first of all, beer to my life. It brings bread to my life. It brings kimchi to my life.
Yeah.
So all these really great things are brought to us by fermentation. And I think fermentation, like burying the dead, is one of the hallmarks of civilization.
Hard agree.
And that's not even to mention this very well-fermented friendship.
Aw.
Well, I think some people call our friendship stinky, but I prefer fermented. In a previous episode, we've discussed materialism, and we even looked at some of the varieties of materialism. We also noted that recently there are two forms of materialism that have developed, sometimes related, but not always: new materialism and feminist materialism. New materialism tends toward a philosophical reflection on advances in science, particularly neuroscience and neurobiology, cognitive science, and so on. But when it comes to feminist materialism, that's not something that's so easy to define because there are many forms that it takes. But there is one issue that feminist materialists have to contend with, namely the way in which the tradition of philosophy in the West has associated the feminine with matter, and then contrasted matter with things it has taken to be more positive, like form or reason, culture or structure. In short, the association of the feminine with matter is yet another way in which the masculine has been privileged throughout the history of philosophy in the West. So a feminist materialism will have to contend with this. Now, luckily, this week we're joined by Emma Bianchi to find out what's the matter with matter. In order to prepare for this conversation, Emma was kind enough to share with us a manuscript of a forthcoming chapter in a book. The chapter is entitled Matter, a Feminist Reading. And I want to thank you, Emma, for sharing that. It's an incredible chapter that goes through the history of matter, and then the history of materialisms, then talks about feminist materialism, black feminist materialism. It really is a very nice sort of précis, but also has an argument. One question I often think about when I'm looking at a concept in philosophy is, what's the problem or what's the issue for which matter is a solution?
Yeah.
But I think we should start, because most people in our audience haven't had a chance to look at the chapter, with an overview of what your concern is and what your argument is in that chapter.
Thanks so much, Rick. I'm going to try my best. The starting place is just to notice that the very word matter itself that comes from Latin is closely related to mater, the word for mother. I mean, I'm always interested in how concepts have come to be, the inceptions of concepts, and how these are more complicated than we might think. But if you then dial back from that Roman moment where the word matter is coined, materia, and then dial back to Greece, it's Aristotle's coinage in his work, hule, that means wood. That is the first word that we translate for matter, the first word that has arisen for matter specifically. Mm-hmm. But what's interesting about this genealogy of this idea in ancient Greece is that pre-Socratic philosophers were concerned with the natural world and the constitution of the natural world, but they didn't have a term specifically for the stuff that was in any way separated from these other concepts that you mentioned earlier, like force or form. It's only when you get that separation from form, really, that matter comes into being. And it starts to nascently come to being in Plato, in Plato's Timaeus, where if the forms, which are abstract and ideal and eternal, are going to be instantiated in the world of becoming, of coming to be and passing away, then there's the question of what are they instantiated in? And this is really the question that inaugurates the notion of matter.
Can I ask you a question really quick? And this is on behalf of both professional philosophers and non-professional philosophers, as Rick refers to them, citizens.
Civilians.
Or civilians, right? Yeah. But I really appreciated that you began with this etymological analysis of the word matter, linking it to mater, and suggesting this foundational connection between matter and femininity. But you can imagine, right, that some people are going to say, well, that kind of reliance on etymology as a basis for a philosophical argument can be problematic because obviously etymological origins do not necessarily dictate conceptual meanings or uses in philosophy. So the historical and cultural evolution of terms can diverge, and often does, significantly from their etymological roots. Yeah. So grounding arguments in etymology, some people might argue, risks oversimplification or worse, anachronism.
Absolutely.
I just want to provide you the opportunity before we kind of dig deeper into this to defend your use of this etymological root.
It's not a grounding argument. It's an indicator of something that is actually in the argumentation. So in Plato's Timaeus, when he first develops this idea of something in which form is instantiated, he uses all these different terms for this. One of them is famously chora. He uses a number of different images to try and explain what he means. He talks about the wax tablet, which receives imprints. He talks about the gold out of which something might be made. Yeah. He talks about an ointment which hasn't yet got the fragrance infused into it. And he also uses the words nurse and mother in that context too. So there's already a distinctly feminine quality to that in which form is instantiated. So form then takes on a kind of paternal role. Matter takes on a maternal role in that it's that which receives the imprint of form. Then the world of becoming, the entities that are coming to being and passing away, are sort of the offspring of these two parents. And this family romance is sort of at the core of really this originary moment. He doesn't yet use the word hule that Aristotle uses for matter, but you can see from all those images or figures that he uses, he's working towards something like that. It's space, it's place, it's not yet congealed into matter. And it's only with the passage into Aristotle that it's more rigorously instantiated as one of the four causes. If you recall from Aristotle, you've got the formal cause, the final cause, what we call the efficient cause, but I like to call the source of motion. That's more close to the Greek, and the material cause. Mm-hmm. So in any instance of coming to be or causation for Aristotle, you have these four causes. And of course, we can't hear it, the cause in the modern sense of sort of billiard ball causation of things acting and reacting to each other. but rather we have a series of things that are responsible. The word is aitia. It means that which is responsible for the coming to be of something.
That's really helpful. And I think it's really important also that the etymological work you're doing here is not a grounding argument. It's an indicator of an ideological development in some ways.
That's right. We've got this metaphysical separation of the four causes for Aristotle, but it's actually in the sexual reproduction of animals that we see this most clearly, because Aristotle's really interested in the question of the coming to be of an entity, ontogenesis. How does something come to be that was not here before? And there are two main ways that can happen. One is through making, and the other one is through reproduction. And because, he's not really looking at single-celled organisms, he can't see bacteria. For him, reproduction is essentially sexual reproduction. He looks at plants and he thinks they have sexual reproduction too, but he's much more interested in animals. So he's got this question of animal reproduction at the center of his problematic around ontogenesis. And in animal reproduction, form is said to derive from the paternal seed, from the male seed, and the matter is the female contribution to the offspring. So you see in a clear empirical instantiation of Aristotle's metaphysical causal theory how this plays out in the actual empirical world. And then this empirical situation becomes a kind of justification for the metaphysical account of coming to be. So I see them as sort of mutually reinforcing in Aristotle. Aristotle's a scientist. His father's a doctor. He cares about observing the empirical physical world. Above all, he cares about change. He cares about movement. He cares about development. And he cares about ontogenesis. And in this instance of sexual reproduction, all of his concerns are concentrated. So Heidegger famously claimed that Aristotle's physics was the hidden and understudied book of Western philosophy. My counterclaim to that is actually it's Aristotle's Generation of Animals that is the hidden and understudied foundational work of Western metaphysics.
I think starting in the Middle Ages, running all the way through the 20th century, we tend to obsess with Aristotle's metaphysics. We don't really look at his biology. And even when we look at the book called The Physics, we come away with a fairly highly metaphysicalized version of the physics, and we tend to focus on the metaphysical issues there. And so I think it really is important to bring Aristotle back to his roots as a scientist and, as you put it, an empirical scientist. But I think that didn't prevent him from bringing to this notion of matter something that is less than empirical, let me say. And I have in mind here that one role that matter plays in Aristotle's philosophy is passivity. That coming to be needs an element, you called it stuff earlier, stuff to which something happens.
Exactly.
Form does something to the stuff that just sits there.
To the receptacle.
Yeah, receptacle, which is maybe one kind of translation of Plato's word chora.
Well, it's a hypodoke. It's literally receptacle also in Plato. That's another figure he uses, so yes.
Yeah, and so matter is passive and is a receptacle. And this is something I was pointing out in my introduction to our conversation that I think comes to dominate the tradition of thinking about matter. And the association of the feminine with matter is that you then have association of the feminine with passivity.
That's exactly right. Yeah. Think again about Aristotle's four causes: formal, the form of a thing, the shape of a thing, the final cause, that for the sake of which it exists, that toward which it aims, as it were, its completion. In the case of an animal organism, it's the final healthy, flourishing form of that organism. And the efficient cause, or the motive cause, which is the source of motion, all three of those are concentrated in the father for Aristotle. And then the only thing that the female adds is this passive matter, which is then acted upon in the sense of a kind of source of motion. So the separation of matter and motion that happens in Aristotle, I think, is absolutely key and sets the tone for our understanding of matter henceforward in the Western philosophical tradition. tradition.
And since you brought up for the sake of which, to set the landscape of our conversation going forward, just for our listeners, what is the point of drawing out this etymological genealogy of the word matter and tying it to the feminine in the way that you do?
Well, I mean, I think this is territory that's really beautifully laid out in the French feminism of the 1970s and 1980s, especially Sixou and Luce Irigaray, who have drawn our attention to the profundity of this gesture in the Western philosophical tradition, insofar as it eclipses any agency that women might have in relation to philosophy, metaphysics, and biology. Right? And human life, because it divests women of any kind of authorial power, making power, effectivity, in fact. And that tradition of French feminism was very keen on trying to excavate, and also using a kind of psychoanalytic methodology as well, these occluded or repressed or hidden dimensions of women's agency, just to put it crudely. I don't know that I'm doing anything that goes beyond that project other than perhaps deepening it and laying it out in the clearest possible terms.
Well, I think that you are doing a considerable amount that goes beyond that project.
Well, thank you.
Don't sell yourself short there. But if I could just get to one important matter that I imagine that we're going to return to many times in the course of this conversation, which is the implicit suggestion of your argument that matter has a kind of agency. Obviously, that's going to rub a lot of people wrong. It's not just civilians, especially philosophers, to think about matter as having a kind of agency. But as I was reading your piece, I was trying to think of what agency in matter would look like. And the best example, and maybe this is not the best example, but the best example that I could come up with was in cooking. I mean, anyone who cooks knows that the materials that you're cooking with, you don't just impose an order on them, right? Like there are orders that they receive and there are orders that they don't receive, or there are orders that you want to impose and they're received in different ways than you meant them or whatever. But it does seem like, at least for me, when I cook, matter is working with me in a way that I don't in general think about, for example, like when I sit in a chair, that matter is working with me.
Yeah, and I think that's a fantastic example, just to kind of pull back a little bit. You're absolutely right. We're always engaging with unexpected qualities of the material world. I mean, magnetism, right? That's so bizarre, right?
Yeah.
Watching a metal move toward another metal, right? Yeah. Matter has sort of strange properties. And of course, we have good scientific accounts of those now. We have an account of how when proteins are heated, they congeal. We understand how all this works on the molecular level. But I wanted to come back to your question about agency itself, because I think there's a number of ways of understanding agency. When one might want to claim matter is agentic, one's not necessarily claiming that it has intentionality or forethought or anything like this. I mean, I think there are some panpsychic positions in the feminist new materialisms that would want to make those kinds of claims. I think, Jane Bennett is somebody who makes claims that are pretty much that panpsychic position. And I know in other kinds of contemporary new materialist thought, panpsychism has a credibility and is taken seriously. I don't necessarily feel that we need to go all the way there. But if you just think of agency as, again, as Rip put it earlier, that which acts upon rather than that which is acted upon, something that has the capacity to act upon something else and be effective, that I think is the kind of agency that we can quite unproblematically say ought to be returned to the material sphere.
I think we should clear up for Dave, my brother-in-law, that panpsychism is the idea that everything has, the Greek word is psyche, so a mind or a soul. And so we often think about agency in the sense of, I want to do this. And so if you say matter has agency, are you saying it has the ability to think, hey, I want to do this? And I think you're pointing out you don't have to have that kind of mind in order to be able to act upon other things. There were a number of philosophers already in the modern period, so maybe late 16th, but certainly in the 17th century. I have in mind Margaret Cavendish.
Absolutely.
Who have an idea that mind has to belong to everything. I wouldn't call it panpsychism, but I think she means it in the sense that you were just pointing out, namely the ability to act upon other things, not the ability to, do formal logic or demonstrate a mathematical principle, but that it has the ability to act on other things in a way that is organized. It's not willy-nilly, but it has a kind of regularity.
That's right. And, it's patently true, just looking at the history of evolution, that matter does seem, in fact, to have a tendency for self-organization. It somehow organized itself into DNA, which somehow organized itself into cells, which somehow organized itself into multicellular organisms, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And here we all are.
This is consistent in what we see in so-called new materialisms that emphasize vitality over agency, right? Like they reconcile this so-called passive nature of matter, but using words that in traditional philosophical vocabulary are tied to mind or intentionality or things like that. And I think that's not hard for regular people, civilians, again, as Rick calls them, to see that there is a kind of vitality to matter that may not exactly square up with what we might call agency, but definitely has something not passive about it.
Right, exactly.
Hey, Hotel Bar Session listeners, this is Rick Lee. Do you know what kind of pillow I use or mattress I sleep on? No, of course you don't. And that's because we don't have any of those stupid ads for pillows or mattresses or any other crap that you don't even want. We are supported by you, our listeners. And if you want to keep our late night conversations flowing, why not do the equivalent of buying us a drink or giving us a high five? You could subscribe to our podcast at Patreon. That's patreon.com/hotelbarsessions. And you could subscribe at many levels. And hey, there's perks at those levels. You could get a coffee mug, or I might even call you out on an episode, or you could get early access to some of our episodes. There are lots of perks there, and we could really use your help. So go to patreon.com/hotelbarsessions and subscribe at any level you feel comfortable with. In the meantime, we'll see you back at the bar. Emma, I think we were just pointing to a little bit of the answer to my question, but I wonder if there are other ways to address how it is that overcoming the association of matter with passivity can be accomplished by a feminist materialism or a feminism that wants to have a different account of matter or a different approach to matter?
I think this is a really complicated question. As I was saying earlier, these questions really began to be addressed by the psychoanalytic French feminists of the second half of the 20th century. And what they were interested in was an excavation and really an overturning, and I would say also a kind of destruction, in a sense, of the Western metaphysical tradition. And in that, they are in a lineage that would include Nietzsche, Heidegger, post-Cartesian existential phenomenology, and then psychoanalytic versions. In fact, it's psychoanalysis that makes possible the coming to center stage, I think, of questions of sexual difference for French thought, in particular in the 20th century. So de Beauvoir is intensely dependent on psychoanalytic thinking in Second Sex, for example. So there's this way in which these feminists are trying to point out the deep complicity of metaphysics and patriarchal thinking, that in order to extricate ourselves both from a hierarchical history of Western metaphysics and women's oppression under conditions of patriarchy, there has to be a critique that dismantles it all at once. That's what's being engaged with. So you've got these ideas of let's try and rethink the status of matter. Let's return movement, force, agency in every sense you like. But, I would prefer perhaps a more limited sense of the word agency to matter, to materiality, materiality as a precondition for a kind of metaphysics we can all live with. But I don't think it's a sufficient condition for feminist politics or women's liberation or anything like that. I mean, these things happen at sort of different conceptual levels, but there are connections nonetheless that need to be exposed and critiqued.
I was really impressed with the work that you did in this very short essay with Lucy Rigrai, Judith Butler, Elizabeth Gross, arguing that the feminine aspects of matter have been appropriated and consequently devalued in Western metaphysics, and then linking them to the broader feminist project of redefining agency. I know you don't want to use the word agency, but redefining both agency and embodiment. And I'm wondering, for the benefit of our listeners who are, I'm going to call them out, analytic metaphysicians, like if you could just articulate exactly how those links are made. I mean, we all know these figures that I just mentioned, Rigrai, Butler, Gross, they're not dominant figures in Anglo-American philosophy. And it's worth having somebody like you on a podcast like this to just draw that out. So I'm asking you just to briefly show how people like Rigrai, Butler, and Gross make this argument that the feminine and maternal aspects of matter have been devalued in Western metaphysics.
It's hard to go into this without a bit of a history of sort of materialist thought and the way that Marx turns Hegel on his head with dialectical materialism by showing how processes of directly political liberation might be related to the material conditions under which we live.
Well, let's go into it.
Yeah, so feminist concerns with matter and materiality also come out of this Marxist Hegelian tradition, where materialism is seen in a kind of dialectical framework as harboring the capacities for a certain kind of overcoming that is political liberation, liberation from oppressive economic forms, the most prevalent and present one of which is capitalism, of course. So you've got this idea of a materialism that has its own internal logic, that can have the capacity to be drawn on in the name of political liberation. And here we're not talking about matter in this metaphysical sense. We're rather talking about human activity that is devoted to the material conditions of our sustenance and the material forces and relations of production that condition our survival, flourishing, life, and so on the planet, and also our relationship, I would say, to the natural world and the environment. So all of these things have a material dimension to them. They have to do with food and shelter and environment and water and so on and so forth. All the material conditions we need for the sustenance of life, human and more than human life. But there's also a way that there's been an intensification within capitalism of the instrumentalization of labor and, of course, women's labor, reproductive labor, sexual labor, all of these different dimensions of everyday bottom wiping that women do all over the world, right? So there are questions of care labor in here as well. And how do we think about that in a modern framework in which the motif or the goal seems to be freedom? Famously, Simone de Beauvoir says women are kind of burdened by their corporeality, by their embodiment. That makes them less able to engage in free projects, right? The free projects of work, of travel, of ideals, I would say, in some ways, like liberal ideals of freedom of movement. And then the question again for feminists is, do we want to fully embrace this idea of a kind of atomistic, individualistic freedom from our connectedness with others, for example, right? Which are also corporeal connections, given that we all have come out of a womb and that those of us who are endowed with wombs may also have other beings come out of us. There's this material dimension of human existence that has been utterly actually covered over in the history of Western philosophy as well. So there are many resonances of trying to bring questions of embodiment, corporeality, and materiality to center stage for feminist thought.
And I think that overcoming of matter within metaphysics that comes along part and parcel with associating the feminine with matter is already there in the story that Plato tells about Thales falling in a well because he's staring up into the heavens. Namely, here is someone, Thales, who we all claim to be the first philosopher in the West. The dude falls in a well because his head is so theoretically clouded. All he can do is think theory that he loses the practical world almost entirely. And yet this is something that then comes to be celebrated, and a metaphysics is developed that actually then grounds that very celebration of the theoretical over the practical. And I think you pointed, Emma, to some of the elements of this, emphasizing things like form or the final cause over matter or the material cause, emphasizing culture over nature, emphasizing reason over body.
Yeah.
So the metaphysical tradition from Aristotle's story of the first philosopher really does kind of stage this connection of what philosophy is with the non-material.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. But one really amusing dimension of that story is that if Thales is falling into a well, he is then engulfed by the very element that he believes is the arche or the origin and principle of the entire cosmos. A lovely sort of tragic dimension to this. You know, this is how I liked also to read the history of Western thought, that even though there are these thrusts toward form and then later spirit or different kinds of disembodied abstractions, that there's a way that this materiality keeps insisting and coming back and making itself felt. And that's, as a reader of the history of the Western tradition, that I'm always wanting to attend to.
You make a pivot in your essay at some point, and I have to admit, when I first read it, I was not entirely convinced by this, but you make this pivot from the insights that we glean from feminist materialist contributions to drawing on scientific concepts from quantum physics and other fields to support these philosophical arguments. And I think that is one of the most fascinating things in this essay. But I also want to ask you whether or not you worry about the fact that certain terms drawn from quantum physics, like quantum entanglement or diffraction, that you use mostly metaphorically, maybe put you in a weird space. Because they're not accurately translated into philosophical discourse, they could lead to some kind of confusion or maybe even, and I'm not accusing you of this, but maybe even a pseudo-scientific justification to this argument. I mean, I think that what you do there is super interesting, but I'm wondering how much you worry about that.
Well, I think what I argued, and I don't know if you read this differently when you were reading it, is that I'm very suspicious of, and we're really specifically referring to the work of Karen Barad here.
Yeah,
they have trained as a physicist, then have written extraordinary contributions to feminist, queer, new materialisms. By drawing on their expertise in a very specifically Bohrian model of quantum physics, their claim, and this is a claim I'm skeptical of, but I also want to think about it more because I'm not sure if I have a final answer on this, but I am skeptical of their claim that these quantum phenomena that are observed at the quantum level can also operate at the macro everyday level in which we move. Barad will point to these instances of a sort of spooky action at a distance in nature, instances of lightning seeming to come up from the ground before it's reached the ground from the sky, brittle stars, and in all these different instances of sort of strange or queer inexplicabilities in the macro world in nature, drawing on quantum physics as a possible ground for explanation of those. Now, I'm not sure about that because it seems to me, and there are lots of arguments about this within the philosophy of physics, there's a way that a classical picture of medium and large size physics and all the forces that are operating and calculable in this realm, that framework's required in order for a quantum universe and all of its strangenesses and its indeterminabilities and so on and so forth to actually be coherent.
Which really means just to show up mathematically, right?
Yeah. But then again, there are also these phenomena which are truly strange. And I can understand the impulse to want to explain these scientifically through scientific frameworks with the languages of science that we have, rather than just sort of stay mystical with them.
Yeah.
But at the same time, one of the most interesting things about matter, as far as I'm concerned, is that it's also a strangely endlessly elusive concept. For Aristotle, he says there's the proximate matter which goes into making something. So if it's a bronze sphere, it's that bit of bronze that went into the sphere. If it's a human or a mammal, right, it's the menstrual blood of the mother that constituted materially, and that was informed by the form and the efficient cause coming from the sperm. So you've got these proximate materials, but can they be broken down into something called matter? Well, you can break them down for the Greeks into the elements, into water or earth or air or fire. Aristotle says, well, the elements are convertible into one another. You see steam rising from water, you see wood going up in smoke. So for Aristotle, the elements can be transformed into one another, but he always falls short of saying there is this underlying matter. Now, of course, atomism gives us a very concrete answer to this. There are atoms and there are void. I mean, this starts with Epicurus, who's just right after Plato. So this is also a very ancient idea. There you have got a very determinate sense of what ultimate matter might be. But there are always these contested ideas of what that is. And of course, when we get into the 20th century and you get into all these strange particles and quarks and Higgs bosons and strange ephemeral particles and so on, it seems that there's a constant open question in nature around matter and materiality. Now, I don't know if I want to sort of go to a mystical place with that and just say, we just have to accept that the universe is not knowable by us in a final way. I'm fine with that, actually. That doesn't need to be mystical. It just says there's an open-endedness to the natural world. Or you can say, well, I think we have a final answer. And that's what I worry with Barrard and fixing of quantum physics as a master discourse through which all these phenomena could be explained.
That's really helpful.
I don't understand why to say that something like matter is fundamentally unknowable or isn't responsive to our capacities for thinking needs to necessarily be mystical, because there are all sorts of things I can't grasp with my hand, steam being one of them. It's not holdable. I can't hold it. But it's not therefore mysterious to me what the fuck it is. And so if we start thinking about thinking, kind of like grasping something with your hand, then to say that it's not graspable doesn't lead to some kind of mystical spiritualism that most popular bookstores would call metaphysics.
Although most popular bookstores would call philosophy metaphysics. Also, aren't bookstores themselves mystical now? Like, I cannot grasp one with my hand.
Yeah, no, I like this idea we might not be able to grasp, but this is also why your work on matter has been so helpful to my thinking as well, Rick. Your book, The Thought of Matter, where what you're concerned with always is this confrontation of thought with these problems. And I'm never so interested in questions of conceptuality. And maybe that's because I feel that the Greeks aren't so interested in them. One of the wonderful things about working on ancient Greek philosophy is that you don't really have to worry about epistemological problems that much, which is, what everybody in the post-Cartesian world is utterly obsessed with. So maybe it's a sidestepping of these real problems. But I think that point that you're making about conceptuality, my question I would want to throw back to you, given that you're somebody who really thought hard about these questions and written about them beautifully, is do you think that this passive matter that is the result of Aristotle's really quite revolutionary conceptual schema is an inevitable byproduct of thinking or of conceptual practice itself?
That's interesting. I would say that it's not that the Greeks don't think about epistemological problems. It's that they're not separate from metaphysical problems or political problems or ethical problems, that there isn't this sort of separation between questions that have to do with knowing versus questions that have to do with what is versus questions that have to do with what should we do and so on. I think you do even see in Aristotle that one of the reasons he doesn't go along with Thales or others like him saying that all things are some kind of matter is because it seems as if he can't give an account of that. I wouldn't say it's the same as conceiving, but it is a way of being able to say what's going on here. And I can't do that if all I say is that there's matter. And I think once you start talking about giving an account, then I think you're going to turn matter into passivity. I like what you said earlier, namely that the non-passive matter as other than passive, it can't seem to be put down finally, and it keeps rearing its head. And it even does in Aristotle. And I really love this example he gives in Book Eta of the Metaphysics, where he says you can't make a saw from wool. There, matter is refusing, right?
Yes.
It's not just sitting there passively, it's saying no to the form.
That's what matter does when I cook sometimes. It refuses. I will not become a sauce.
Well, and the older I get, I find my body is that same way with long nights of drinking alcohol.
The corporeality fights back. Right. But no, I mean, Rick, I really appreciate you bringing this up, because the fact that matter doesn't behave as it should is at the very heart of the analysis I propose of Aristotle in my book, The Feminine Symptom.
Right.
Because, of course, if the form comes from the father and the matter comes from the mother, ideally one would only ever have male offspring.
Right.
So the whole source of the fact that there are female offspring is the fact that matter is recalcitrant, matter disobeys, matter misbehaves, and so on and so forth. Even at the point where you have this incredibly, almost sort of tightly wrought co-justification between the empirical and the metaphysical in the scene of sexual reproduction and separation and conjoining of matter and form, you have what I have called the feminine symptom. The reason it's symptomatic is not simply that matter misbehaves, which is one way of thinking about the symptom, but it's also that there's a paradox because organisms have to be kept in being, right? There's this teleology in Aristotle where things just keep reproducing and continuing and in a way working towards their good, which for Aristotle in this case, when it comes to human life or animal life, is living and living well. So you have this sort of paradoxical situation where matter's capacity for misbehavior is actually fulfilling the teleology of life. And that's a very, very fundamental contradiction that I try and excavate, that I think infuses Aristotle's work, where there's this dimension of materiality just behaving again in this sort of indeterminate, aleatory way for the thought and within the empirical world as well.
Right. Yeah.
Listeners, have you ever thought to yourself, I'd really love to join them after this episode for a drink? Well, you could do that if you wanted to fly Rick and David from Chicago or me from Memphis to wherever you are, and we're not taking that option off the table. But in the meantime, we'd love to hear back from all of you via social media. You can reach us on Twitter at Hotel Bar Podcast, on Facebook, and on YouTube. You can always email us at hotelbarpodcast@gmail.com, and we will respond. Look, we know you're out there. We've got the data, and we want to hear from you. Books or articles we should read, interview guests we should have, topics we should cover, we're listening. Sometimes podcasting feels like shouting into a void, and so we always appreciate hearing back from our listeners. In the meantime, back to the episode. So Emma, you're one of my friends who is a scholar. And I really appreciate that about you. And I really appreciate that about the work that you do. But as you know, that's not the kind of scholar I am. I like to bring this back to the world, and I want to know how it impacts, in particular, the social and political ramifications of philosophy that's being done. So I want to ask you a couple of questions and see what you have to say about this. So one of the things I really love about this work is you're not only highlighting the contributions of materialist feminists for rethinking the concept of matter, but also you're connecting that to perspectives from Black studies, especially in relation to how Black bodies have been historically marginalized. And I'm wondering how you see these interactions in the work that you've done, complicating or forwarding feminist theories of matter. That is to say, both what insights do Black feminist perspectives bring to this conversation, and also, what is the end gain of this?
Well, thank you so much for that. I'll do my best to address it. So one of the reasons for turning to thinking about the body and materiality in Black studies is that, of course, with the rise of modernity, you get this whole new rise of calculative logics that are seeking to contain, organize, put bodies to work in new ways. And there's no more extreme illustration of this than the Atlantic slave trade, in which bodies are not simply made into commodities to be bought and sold, which of course they are, but also, as Hortense Spillers very powerfully and very influentially argued, have been made into flesh, have been atomized, have been pulverized. Not only were kinship structures absolutely destroyed, but also visceral corporeal bonds between mothers and children were destroyed in the slave trade. There was a sort of extremity of violence that was meted upon the bodies and actually in some ways sought to reduce them to what has been called as a term of art flesh in Black studies. But one of the most interesting strands to me in some recent Black studies also shows how this commodification and use of Black bodies within white supremacy and within slavery has not just thought of Black bodies as passive, but also as lively, as vital, as full of rhythm and dance and entertainment and so on and so forth, right? So this is one of the ways that white supremacy has consumed African cultures and the ways of being embodied that we understand or associate with Blackness. So taking up that work, Alexander Wahalia uses the word pornotroping to describe the ways that, say, for example, in films about slavery, the camera lusciously lingers over the screaming, excoriated flesh of someone being whipped, right? And that there's a kind of libidinal payoff for the viewer in viewing this. So I wanted to think very seriously about how returning vitality to matter is by no means sufficient as a political goal for feminist thought or critical race theory or for anything that is seeking a liberatory model, since that too is so commodifiable and has been patently and violently commodified and consumed. As a politics, this has limitations, but one of the things that I do want to emphasize in terms of maybe some of the contemporary power of these critiques is that by emphasizing aleatory materiality of bodies, that is the ability of bodies to move in any direction, to desire all different kinds of pleasures, to organize affective kinship ties in all kinds of new ways.
And to resist in all kinds of ways.
But if we understand bodies as not teleologically organized in any particular fashion, it doesn't mean that we're all pulverized into atoms, but it means that we are free, in a sense, to reformulate sociality and familiality in ways that are more liberatory and less oppressive. And of course, organize gender identifications and so on in all kinds of ways as well. This push that has been manifested, let's say, in the whole LGBT movement and the spread of LGBT rights internationally has been met now with a huge populist backlash, often but not exclusively emanating from the Vatican, You have a very powerful move towards reconsolidating the patriarchal family, reconsolidating the idea of this male protector, the paternal line, the absolute confluence of women, children, and property that must be protected by their male protector at all costs, right? I mean, I think this is at the heart of gun culture in the US and US racism, which is protecting white families from the threat of black incursion, essentially, and the way that populisms are mobilizing ideas of the traditional family. So I think there is a powerful liberatory thrust in this thinking and in this work. Maybe it's metaphorical, but maybe it's also real as manifesting in our everyday lives, in our affective lives, in our political lives, in our cultural lives, and so on.
Yeah, as a childless cat lady in the United States, where our vice presidential candidate has just disavowed all of us, I want to reinforce what you just said, that there is an importance to drawing attention to the way that metaphysical discourses, which are as ancient as, Aristotle, reinforce contemporary political and moral problems that it's very hard for us to see without going back and doing the hard work that scholars like you do.
I would argue that these metaphysical discussions and metaphysics itself is a symptom in the sense that you, Emma, insist on using the word symptom in your book, The Feminine Symptom. If we think about a disease and we have symptoms of the disease, the symptoms are not the disease itself.
Yeah.
But it's not a sign at the same time. So it points to a disease, but not in the same way that a sign points to the thing it's signifying. And so I really like the way you develop the notion of symptom there. And I think metaphysics is a symptom of a disease that is happening in society. I'm with both of you on this. I think the emphasis on controlling reproductive rights goes back to the thing you were talking about earlier, Emma, namely the material conditions of production are often done at the cost of women's contributions that are appropriated without being exchanged for a wage. The labor of rearing a family, the next generation of the working class. And so I think all of these discourses are really intimately connected.
If I could just add on to that, to say that another great contribution that your scholarship makes is to show that resistance itself is a form of agency. And I think that one of the things that we're seeing in the U.S. political landscape today is that women's resistance is often our only form of agency. But it is there. It is there. It is real. It is measurable. And it might not be entirely controllable.
Well, that's right. And I mean, I think giving rein to women's sexuality, I mean, this is still a taboo. There's all this talk about, women are sexualized and this is a very terrible thing. But what if women were probably not in the workplace, but in other kinds of spaces in which we move, sexualizing themselves? Imagine that.
What?
I know, right?
Shut your mouth.
Crazy sounds come out of her talking hole.
Emma, it has been such a pleasure to have you here for this conversation. Unfortunately, you and Rick and I have all experienced this before. We're getting last call again.
No.
And our previous real life experiences, we just ignore that. But we are on a podcast and we have to respect it. So I just want to thank you so much for coming on here and having this conversation with us. I was really apprehensive about this because I don't read Greek as well as either of you, and I'm not an expert in ancient philosophy, but this has just been so informative and so helpful for me. So I just really thank you for doing this.
Oh, well, thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to have been on the podcast and chatting with the two of you about my work. I really have enjoyed the whole thing from start to finish. So thank you both so much.
And for our listeners, can you tell them where they're going to be able to read this chapter in the future?
I'm going to need to find the reference now.
This is why Lee makes the big bucks.
which is the no books.
I was going to say, next year we're doubling your salary.
Doubling my salary from 0 to 0 just for this edit alone.
So you'll be able to read the essay in a volume forthcoming from Routledge called The History and Philosophy of Materialism, edited by Charles Wolfe and John Simmons.
Well, we're super looking forward to that. And again, thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks, Emma.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye.